when looking at existential risks, policymakers may have a key question to consider. How should governments use their limited resources, of both attention and money, when faced with a range of threats with different likelihoods and on timelines varying from right now to the far distant future? We are pleased to have a panel of experts who can explore the topic of existential risks with curiosity and diversity from Brazil, China, the UK, and the United States. Here to moderate this conversation is Duncan Cass-Beggs. Duncan was until recently the head of strategic foresight at the OECD, where, among other things, his team launched an ongoing collaborative initiative on anticipating and managing emerging global existential risks. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you very much. Greetings et un grand bonjour à toutes et à tous. I'm delighted to moderate this discussion today on some of the most challenging and rapidly evolving issues facing the global community. As mentioned, existential risks are defined as risks that could lead to the extinction of humanity or a similar irreversible and permanent destruction of humanity's long-term potential. Natural existential risks like asteroid strikes or gamma-ray bursts have existed for millennia, but these are generally considered fairly low likelihood in the short term. Experts in existential risk typically focus on more of the anthropogenic or human-made risks. The invention of nuclear weapons in the 20th century, for example, is viewed as one of the first times humanity created the potential to actually destroy itself. However, it's unlikely that this will be the last human invention to pose this level of risk. Today, experts are particularly concerned about emerging existential risks from technology. These include biorisks such as engineered pandemics, artificial intelligence such as the creation of an uncontrollable artificial superintelligence, and finally, other new rapidly emerging technologies that we may not have yet even imagined. So if we step back, there are a few key features to highlight about existential risk. And I think first one is that they're fundamentally uncertain. This is why they're classified as risks. Nobody knows for sure the probabilities or the timelines. It could be decades, or it could be just a few years or months. In face of this uncertainty, governments need to be ready for different scenarios, including the worst case scenarios. And that's where strategic foresight really has a crucial role. Second, these risks are global. There can, of course, be existential risks to individual communities or organizations, but we're focusing today on what could plausibly result in the extinction of all of humanity. These risks may be caused by the decisions of just a few people in one part of the world, but they would have an impact on all humans, and as a result, all humans have a stake in preventing them. Third and finally, existential risks are often neglected. Existential risks are by no means the only risks or only challenges that need to be addressed by society, but somewhat paradoxically, existential risks are often actually neglected by governments. This is partly due to their scale and their complexity, and to the fact that they are often outside the short-term and predominantly national focus of policymakers. So this session aims to help address that gap, that neglectedness, by building understanding and making the case for more effective action. The session will really be in two parts. First, we're at what are the greatest existential risks facing humanity? And second, what needs to be done to better anticipate and manage these risks? So with that, I'm now delighted to introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Rosa Alegria, who is co-chair of the Millennium Project in Brazil. We have Jessica Bland, Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. Paul Edwards is co-director of the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative at Stanford University. And Brian Tsay is the founder and CEO of Concordia Consulting in Beijing. A warm welcome and thank you to all of you. So let us get started with the first set of questions to explore the greatest existential risks currently facing humanity. Jessica, The Center for the Study of Existential Risks at Cambridge is one of several organizations focused on studying existential risks. What does CSER see as the greatest existential risk currently facing humanity? What are the objectives, main areas of research and activities of your team and others in this area of work?
Thank you, Duncan, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm speaking from Cambridge in the UK, in case you were confusing it with the US city. So our centre is 10 years old, and a lot of our work started with our founders that include Jan Tallinn, the technology entrepreneur, and Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal in the UK, who were very much part of that generation of scholars and thinkers thinking about the technological risks that we bring in the 21st century that could lead us to existential risk. And that means our team is really organized under those kinds of technologies. So we have a group looking at AI risk, and I won't speak too much to that today because other people will. We have a team looking at natural risk, but also how anthropogenic influences on our environment make those risks perhaps stronger or greater or more unusual in the 21st century. And we also have a team looking at biological risk and biological security. And with the recent pandemic, I think we don't have to make the case very much anymore as to understand how those can become totally global phenomena. We're very keen to look at the interrelations between these risk areas, and I'm glad to see that polycrisis has recently been added to the list of risks. That's something we so very much support. We're essentially a team of 20 postdoctoral researchers in Cambridge who sit every day and look at the interactions between our risk areas, how each of them might affect the other, and how we might mitigate or govern them better in the future. I wanted to say a couple of words about biological risk, however, in particular. So biological risk at CSER really has its genesis as a team thinking about bioterror risks. In fact, for those who've been around this area for some time, they'll know that one of our co-founders, Martin Rees, had a bet with Steven Pinker back in 2017 that there would be a bioterror error incident that would cause large-scale death before the end of the year 2020. It's still under dispute as to whether one or the other of those won that bet, but it certainly became a very pointed topic of study. But interestingly, as that team has grown over the years, the way that we've studied biological risk has also grown. So particularly focused on infectious diseases to begin with. Things like the idea that if you combined some of the horrific physical effects of Ebola and the infectious potential of flu, you could easily see pandemics that had a much greater effect in terms of the morbidity globally than even COVID did. But increasingly, colleagues like Leeta Sundaram have also looked at how biological industries around the world, the proliferation of the use of E. coli in food production or other things, can lead to complex risks that come from agriculture as well as from mammalian reservoirs. And so I would point to some of her work that's very interesting from a couple of years ago that looks at how biofoundries or DIY bio, something where everyone is doing biology in their garage, could actually become a very large scale risk very quickly if those garages were all around the world, and certain more dangerous pathogens would be able to be prepared at that level. I also point to a very interesting project that our colleague Freya Jeffcott is working on with researchers in Canada, looking at novel zoonotic risks that are coming from ice melt in northern Canada, and working with Inuit population to really understand whether the changes to ecology there lead us to the defrosting, essentially, of organisms that could lead to very widespread morbidity amongst humanity. What's interesting about that project is it takes the lab out into the community. So they're also thinking about the mitigation or the monitoring of that risk by DNA sequencing out within those communities and developing the technology and skills there to hopefully reduce or mitigate those risks at the same time as understanding them better. I don't have much more time, but there's a few more projects I'd like to speak to. I'd probably choose just one, which is a very successful futures exercise we did a few years ago, looking at 80 questions for biosecurity. And the success of that project was really not to answer those questions, but to provoke and say that there was a longer list of risks that could become existential around biosecurity that aren't being looked at by policymakers. And we now know that that list has been very influential on broadening the agenda around biosecurity in the UN family. So really a good example of foresight work that had impact in this area. I'll stop there. Thank you, Duncan. Thank
you, Jessica. So next to you, Paul, you are a lead author for the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and you also have a background in nuclear safety issues. So what insights can you share on the status of these two risks? And given our focus today on existential risks, are there scenarios whereby climate change or nuclear war could not only be catastrophic, but even lead to human extinction?
Okay, thanks, Duncan. Well, with respect to climate change, I think everybody knows the news is not great. We're already at about 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and we probably will exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade sometime in the next 10 years. So within this century, on the path we currently are on, we're likely to hit at least 2 or 2.5 degrees centigrade, even with the best possible climate policy. And that level is already more dangerous than we realized even 10 years ago. Just since IPCC 21, the report I was on, there's new information on ocean heating, ice sheet melting, Arctic warming, and ocean circulation, all of those showing worse effects than previously realized. So what kind of extreme scenarios of climate change could be existential threats? Well, for one thing, we already know that we're facing irreversible tipping points. Arctic and Antarctic sea ice are declining fast. The northern tree line is advancing fast. Both of those things are making the Arctic darker, and that creates a substantial possibility of a positive feedback. The darker it is, the more radiation it absorbs. Right now, while it's still mostly white, it reflects heat. If it's darker, it would absorb it and become a positive feedback. And already the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the globe. Even 3 or 4 years ago, we thought that was 2 times faster. All of that will affect permafrost melting, which is underway. That will release methane, and that will continue even without human greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking at positive feedbacks that we probably can't control. So the worst case scenario, even on a sort of medium range IPCC scenario, is carbon dioxide doubling near the end of this century. On that scenario, what happens after 2100? Well, if climate sensitivity is high, on the high end of the range, Earth could hit 5 degrees centigrade or more of warming in the 2 or 3 centuries beyond 2100. Let me move on to nuclear war. It's been almost 80 years since our last nuclear war and over 30 years since the end of the Cold War, and that's great. We haven't had a nuclear war in that entire time. A US-Russia war is unlikely but possible. Our current situation is that we still have over 11,000 warheads in the USA and Russia. About 3,700 of those are deployed and ready to use. So the worst case, of course, is a war between NATO and Russia. I still think that's unlikely, but we are at the highest threat level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Putin continues to issue nuclear threats. NATO is treading very carefully. If there were an all-out US-Russia nuclear war, nuclear winter would probably ensue. That's been almost forgotten, but studies done in the last decade show that it's worse than previously realized. The northern hemisphere would likely drop below freezing in the summer and stay dark for a decade or more. Up to 2 billion deaths would ensue. Now, what about your final question? What about the issue of total extinction? Well, I think in both of these cases, total extinction is quite unlikely. On the climate change case, I do think civilizational collapse is plausible within the next 2 or 3 centuries. And we might see a shift of agriculture and human habitation to higher latitudes. And if it, on the high end scenarios, that would mean abandoning the tropics altogether. On the nuclear case, total extinction also seems very unlikely. The southern hemisphere would be less affected, But on the other hand, the collapse of industrial civilization in the event of a nuclear war is very possible.
Thanks very much, Paul. It sounds like even if these risks are not necessarily existential, they are nonetheless tragically catastrophic and therefore in need of continuing urgent steps to address. So thank you. Brian, your Beijing-based consulting firm aims to ensure that artificial intelligence is developed safely and for the common good. What's the status of AI development today, and why is it considered by some to be an existential risk?
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I have 3 points to make. First, the state-of-the-art AI systems are already highly capable and will likely become far more powerful within this decade. Over the past few months, we have seen a rapid explosion of large generative models like ChatGPT and GPT-4. Recently, Microsoft Research investigated GPT-4 regarding its ability to solve novel and difficult tasks ranging from mathematics, coding, medicine, law, and more. And the authors conclude that it could reasonably be viewed as an early yet still incomplete version of an artificial general intelligence system, as defined as an AI that can accomplish any intellectual task that humans can perform. And over the next 5 years, we may expect around 1,000 times increase in the computation used to train the largest models. And if experts' predictions about current trends in large models hold, this would result in a capability jump that is significantly larger than the jump from GPT-2 to GPT-3. And this jump, according to some of the expert intuitions and assessment, could result in human-level performance across most cognitive tasks by humans. And second, there is already a range of risks associated with these state-of-the-art AI systems. Since these large language models are very good at generating realistic content, they also have the ability to deceive humans. For example, as part of a test to see if GPT-4 can exhibit dangerous capabilities, GPT-4 managed to hire a real human worker over TaskRabbit to solve a CAPTCHA for it by pretending to be a vision impaired human. And this same ability to generate realistic content can also create automatic misinformation at a scale that we have never seen before. AI could also accelerate other catastrophic risks, such as the design of weapons of mass destruction. In a study published by Nature last year, researchers explore how AI systems for drug discovery could be misused. And these researchers developed an AI model that come up with 40,000 ideas for potentially lethal chemical molecules in just under 6 hours. And third, I think we should take the possibility of existential risk from AI seriously as we extrapolate these progress into the future. According to an expert survey done last year, nearly half of top AI researchers from around the world think that there is at least a 10% chance of AI causing human extinction. Another survey done here in Beijing by a professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences find that the majority of over 1,000 Chinese respondents believe that AGI could pose existential risk to humanity. And why is that? The basic argument is as follows. We might build AI systems which are far more powerful and intelligent than humans. And these AI systems could be autonomous agents pursuing ambitious large-scale goals in the world. And they might aim towards outcomes and goals that are not exactly what humanity values. And this would lead to AI gaining control of the future of humanity. And currently, the world's leading scientists admit that there are no reliable techniques for steering the behavior of the state-of-the-art AI systems. And they also don't have great explanation for what is going on inside these large neural nets, what they call black boxes. So this is not a great situation to be in. Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI here from Canada, recently quit Google and said that AI could pose an existential threat. And he mentioned that it's close enough that we ought to be working very hard right now. And I agree. The bottom line is that global policymakers need to be prepared for the worst case scenarios and start taking action to prevent them. I will stop here. Thank you, Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. Rosa, we've now heard about a number of different potential existential risks, from climate to nuclear war to biotech to AI. As a professional futurist and advocate for futures literacy, I wonder if you could help take us a step back and ask more generally why it is that we as a society are creating these existential risks and why we don't seem to be better at addressing them. Behind each specific technology and each specific risk, is there a bigger problem with our cultures or human nature that we would need to solve so that we could stop creating the seeds of our own destruction?
Thank you, Duncan. It's a pleasure to be here. To answer this question, I will talk about the metaphor of an iceberg. The visible and upper parts respond to the tangible threats we just heard about from the other speakers. We are all aware about that, but we are less aware of the lower part of the iceberg, the intangible dimensions of human nature and culture that are underlying the cause of the tangible risks. So I will highlight three main threats I consider in the intangible dimension. The first one is the short-term thinking. We live in an era of immediacy and short-termism. Educational, business, and political systems normally don't look beyond the next election of the latest poll or the next tweet. Policy horizons, Canada is a light for other governments in the world. Companies, for instance, companies are slaves to the next quarterly report and the constant demand to increase shareholder value in their short-term interests. So short-term culture permeates our entire culture of instant gratification and short-term planning. And when I was a kid, it was easier to visualize the next 50 years. Today, we have lost that temporal vitality. It is increasingly difficult to visualize the future. Ask a teenager what he can see, and he can't. This is the age of tyranny of the now. And this is a threat because it causes to do things blindly that could lead to the great harm. Thinking about the future is an ethical issue. So we need to take greater responsibility for the indigenous people in Latin America have this idea of being responsible for responsible ancestors. And Western culture needs to relearn this. So the second threat is future's illiteracy. We not only need to think longer term, we also need to stretch our imagination about what is possible in the future. And in this context, foresight and futures literacy can help us to break free by challenging assumptions and broadening our ideas about how the world could be different. Understanding history is important, but it is also essential to teach the future, because it is there that we will find our answers to these tangible threats. And the third threat is imagination atrophy. The 20th century was a century of dystopias, and this one is the same. We need utopias to help us find ways out of these threats. If we think only of dystopias, we become a frightened society. Fear paralyzes society, generates apathy, and also violence. According to the Dutch sociologist Fred Polak, in his masterful work called The Image of the Future, societies that don't nurture positive images of the future tend to disappear. So to summarize, the existential risks described today are a sign of that our culture and societies are not prepared to face these threats. They are too short-termist and too afraid to imagine the full range of better futures that are possible. So foresight can foster a shift, building foresight capacities in early stages like primary schools and high schools to develop future thinkers, and in global agencies like UN, These all can reduce or mitigate threats, or at least prepare governments and society as a whole to be aware of threats and prevent them. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Okay, well, we will now turn to our second set of questions, which is really what is needed to manage these global risks, and how could countries like Canada best contribute? So I'm going to turn to you first, Jessica. I understand that CSER has a bit of a hybrid approach in addressing global existential risks. Could you tell us a bit about why this approach is important for addressing existential risks and what others should do to emulate it?
Thank you. And yes, by hybrid approach, we're really referring to both understanding of risk, so of the high impact but low probability threats that we could face, but not just that dystopian future, as Rosa would put it, but also the positive mitigating steps we can take to bring greater resilience, not just within the nations we're in, but global resilience and global human security. And that means the way that CSER works is increasingly outside of the UK, often with communities who are really facing the beginnings of what had become existential threats. And this seems sensible to us because, as my colleague Kayla Lucero-Mateucci recently said in an article for the Bulletin, resilience against one risk may also aid readiness to any other. And many of these steps we can take against some risks like climate change may help us against other risks like biosecurity in the future. So just to mention two projects quite quickly. Firstly, my colleague Lara Mani's PhD research began by working with communities in Caribbean islands at risk of volcanic eruption, not just to understand the geology of the eruption, which she did, and in the case of St. Vincent, it actually erupted during her PhD, so she got to learn in a very live way how these things play out, but also to really understand the risk perceptions and the modes of action in those communities if that risk did emerge, and help them avoid unnecessary deaths or injury or loss of earnings in those situations. And she found out things like they all listen to the local radio. They don't read Twitter. Many of them will communicate via SMS, not WhatsApp. So all of their warning systems were set up with that in mind, really understanding their knowledge and their ways of working, but also their historical knowledge of their own volcanoes and the things they already had in place to mitigate that risk. Secondly, I'd speak to Freya Jeffcott's work, whose work I mentioned earlier in Canada. She has another study with other epidemiologists, so people who study disease around the world, producing a handbook for district disease control officers. So these are often people, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries, who are the first point of call, the first responder when we see diseases like Ebola that then had global influence, teaching them to have the skills of the epidemiologists to start to really monitor those diseases when they first break out. And to take those skills outside the laboratory in places like Cambridge and take them into the places where these diseases may well start out. So a lot of our work is increasingly on the ground, working on projects like that, and then understanding how those individual instances can help us think about more systemic resilience globally. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jessica. Brian, what do you think are some of the most important actions needed to address existential risk from AI? Also, from your position in China, what do you think may be required in terms of global collaboration on this issue to safeguard the future of humanity?
Thank you. I think there are three important actions to address existential risk from AI. First, we need to invest in AI safety, alignment, and interpretability R&D. 99% of AI research go to making AI more powerful, and only 1% goes to making it more safe. But what is happening inside these neural networks? What will large models be capable of as we scale up investments into their training? How do we ensure that AI systems could act according to human goals and values? We just need much more research into these questions, and governments can help increase the R&D funding support for these important and neglected areas. There are a number of more technical proposals for answering these questions that I won't go into today. But if you are a policymaker interested in this, you should talk to top scientists and experts working on these issues. Second, I think we need to accelerate AI safety evaluations, standards, and ultimately regulations. So, for example, government can require certain kinds of AI incidents to be reported, similar to the best practices in other industries like aviation and computer security. The goal of this is to allow regulators to track certain kinds of harms and close calls from AI systems, to monitor where the dangers might be, and rapidly evolve mitigation mechanisms. The AI industry should also have testing and evaluation requirements, especially to ensure that frontier AI models pass certain safety standards and do not exhibit dangerous capabilities before they are deployed. Governments can also track and require a license to develop frontier AI models, and this would improve government visibility into potentially dangerous AI model development and to allow for more control over their proliferation internationally. Finally, I would say that we also need to consider international regulations, agreements, and cooperation. We might need international monitoring and verification for training the most advanced AI systems, similar to the international regime for preventing nuclear proliferation and ensuring nuclear security. And insofar as AI systems become increasingly powerful and that we lack robust safety technical solutions at the moment, we might need to consider slowing down progress on the frontier AI development. And the international society has hit pause on other technologies with potentially catastrophic effects, with examples such as human cloning, human germline modification, gain-of-function research, and chemical weapons, and more. And so we might be able to do the same with especially dangerous type of AI systems. To conclude, I think preventing global existential risk from AI would be in the common interest of all nations and people and all of humanity, and we should seek to advance this global conversation.
Thanks very much, Brian. Next, Rosa, the Millennium Project that you work with was instrumental in pushing the UN to pay greater attention to emerging global existential risks, and you've been part of the preparations for the UN Summit of the Future in 2024. Could you tell us a bit more about the role of the UN and global collaboration in addressing existential risks and how countries like Canada could best contribute to these efforts?
Okay. In our common agenda, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, highlights the stagnation of society in relation to how all humanity risks. The report calls for many excellent improvements, including a Futures Lab, a summit on the future, and a better preparation to prevent and respond to major global risks to be held in the next assembly. The Millennium Project, led by Jerome Glenn, prepared an open letter signed by more than 200 futurists, calling for a feasibility study to create a UN office on strategic on existential threats to humanity. So this led to the five elements, foresight elements of our common agenda, and it's now supposed to include existential risks now. So this new emphasis on global strategic foresight for humanity is unique in the history of the United Nations and the world. So we have to celebrate this. Jerry Glenn, with the help of Global Notes, the Global Notes submitted a brief on 10 threats. One of them is AI, and not narrow. It is AGI before it gets created. So how could Canada best contribute to these efforts? Well, Canada could introduce a resolution to the UN General Assembly this fall for the establishment of our working group for the UN Convention on the AGI, and bring it up at the ministers' meeting this fall as inputs to the UN Summit of the Future as an agenda item. So before closing, we have to look at whose futures we are talking about. We are talking about global threats, but we have to keep in mind that around us, there are several futures. So we cannot ignore the different social realities. I come from a country like Brazil, where perhaps the desired future for a mother who lives in a favela in Rio or any other city in Latin America is not exactly a world without wars or a world facilitated by technologies. For that person, perhaps what is important is having to eat, getting a roof over their heads. So we have to pay attention to the emerging movements, working towards the decolonization of youth movements by indigenous people and by the youth. Indigenous make up 2% of the world's population, but conserve 80% of natural resources. And youths are the ones who will live on this planet that needs to be regenerated. So we have been imagining the end of the world, from apocalypse to zombie movies, from viruses to alien attacks, from the dangers of AI to nuclear war. But we're not imagining a change in the underlying development model. So this is about sustainability, plurality. A development model that benefits all of humanity is the best foundation for the planet and for sustainability. Thank you. This is all.
Thank you, Rosa. Excellent and important point. Finally, Paul, you have been working on two of the greatest existing global risks for some time now. What can we learn from the experience of global collaboration on climate change and nuclear risks that could be applied to dealing with emerging global risks like bio and artificial intelligence?
Sure. So the lesson from the nuclear experience, let me put it this way: keep as much of the genie in the bottle as you can. There's immense value to the non-proliferation agreement, and that has potential applications to biotech and AI, which are still developing and where there's still a chance for that. Other lessons from the nuclear experience: deterrence works, but it's extremely risky. It depends on unviable assumptions, such as rational leaders and error-free launch control and fully loyal and responsible human command chains. Nuclear accidents are not just possible, they're actually probable. They have already happened many times and been narrowly avoided, actual war scenarios. One of the better solutions would be Seth Baum's proposal to reduce to no more than 50 nukes per nation. That would avoid the worst risk of nuclear winter. And then again, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been extremely valuable. We face the prospect of breakout by Iran and others. There's also distrust of the United States emerging and some other countries now thinking of breaking out of the NPT. So let's try to preserve that. Another corollary is always go back to the bargaining table. One of the things that happened at the end of the Cold War, super valuable, was track 2 diplomacy, which means scientists and nuclear workers in both the US and the Soviet Union worked with each other to help disarm Ukraine. That's turning out not so great in a way right now, but it's still better than the situation we had. So we need more of that always. Lessons from climate change: well, there the genie is already completely out of the bottle. So the big lesson is that there is immense path dependence. There's a momentum to infrastructure. The fossil fuel infrastructure is huge, it's valuable, it's politically powerful, and most individuals are personally involved in it and committed to it by their lifestyles. So my lesson from this is that the only real policy is infrastructure itself. Whatever we plan for the future only works if it's actually built. So we are building new infrastructure with renewables and electrification. We're moving way too slowly, need to move faster. There's also the issue of ideological polarization. That's been a huge thing in climate change. And what that leads to is that knowledge alone matters a lot, but it's not enough, because the best knowledge we have is denied and pushed aside by many people because it's in their interest. It's pushed aside by institutions like the fossil fuel lobbies because it's in their interest. And people in general are, as Rosa was just saying, inherently short-term thinkers. So we need more long-term thinking. That takes work, it takes organization, it takes evidence. There are institutions like the IPCC that can be examples, but those are onerous for scientists. They're hard to integrate into other institutions, and they tend to be technocratic. So we need institutions that are focused on long-term risk, but we also need them to be integrated into other shorter focused policy processes. Really, in a nutshell, what I could say about it is we need to apply the precautionary principle to the long term. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much. That's excellent. So listen, that brings us to the end of this session. We've heard about some fairly sobering global risks and about how all four of the ones that we looked at, nuclear, climate, bio, and AI, are all evolving very rapidly, not necessarily in the right direction. We also heard about some of the solutions, though. These include technical solutions, but also governance solutions, and crucially, the importance of strategic foresight to help us prepare for multiple scenarios. Some of these steps may be needed very rapidly, but we also heard about the need to address the social, cultural, ethical justice issues that will ultimately underlie humanity's ability to make good decisions and safeguard its future. Perhaps one of the most optimistic points to end on is the reminder that these risks are human-made. That means that they are, to some extent, a human choice. The shape of technological development is not predetermined or inevitable. With the necessary foresight, resolve, and collective efforts, human societies can navigate these risks successfully. This will, however, require our increasing attention. With that, I want to say a very warm thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining in. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, Rosa, Jessica, Paul, and Brian. What a fascinating conversation on the topic of threats to humanity from a global panel of thought leaders. The topic is vast and opinions diverse. It has been enlightening to hear about the risks that could cause long-term devastation or even extinction, and what is being done to further awareness, research, and, where needed, mitigation.